All right. Well, good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jorrick Beckers. I've been here. I've been a PhD student here for the last 5 years. And today I'd like to tell you a little bit about my research, give you an outline of my thesis, and and the results. Let me test first if this works, because I use PowerPoint at home. But over here, I guess I have to use the arrows, as was explained to me. Well, I'm going to start with an introduction into my topic. Later on, I'll tell you a little bit about my research questions and, the results of those research questions. And I'll end with a conclusion and directions for further research. To start, I'd like you to meet Cleveland. Cleveland is a senior vocational student, and he dreams of someday owning his own dry cleaner shop. Well, to do so, he is now studying senior vocational education at his local community college, and there he's studying entrepreneurship. Well, in this kind of education, he's actually following competency-based education, and this helps him to learn the necessary skills, knowledge, and attitudes he needs to become a successful shop owner. However, to complete this sort of education, Cleveland needs to develop self-directed learning skills, which are also very valuable later on in his life when he needs to continue learning. Well, to tell you a little bit about my definition of self-directed learning skills, I'd like to give you a practical example. Let's assume that Cleveland already has a practical internship at a local dry cleaning office, and he got the job to clean a pair of jeans. Well, as you can see here, Cleveland got the jeans, and this happened. The jeans broke, and obviously the customer is not very happy. Well, for Cleveland, this is a learning moment. First, he has to ask himself, what was my level of performance here? Well, as you can probably guess, Cleveland didn't do very well, because the one thing you should do as a dry cleaner is not destroy people's clothes. And how he should learn this is, well, let me rephrase that. How he should understand what his performance is. He should use some performance criteria, and also actually just test what the customers think about his performance. And after he's established his performance, he has to ask himself, what do I need to improve about my performance so that next time I will deliver clothes which aren't broken? Well, you can imagine a lot of things he could have done better, but for example, in this specific example, Cleveland he worked in a dry cleaner shop where there's a lot of sharp objects near the conveyor belt, and obviously this broke the pants. And what he thought about improving his performance is, well, maybe I should not put the clothes so very near to the sharp objects, because, well, afterwards my pants broke. Another option is to choose a learning task which is more suitable for his learning needs. You could also imagine that Cleveland was working during very busy business hours, and he had a lot of different traffic which he had to handle. And then he may decide, well, it was too busy for me, maybe I should choose a learning task which is a little bit easier. So he might have chosen to just go and work at less busy hours. Well, to put it more formal or in a more conceptual way, we define self-directed learning as a cyclical process of self-assessment of performance, formulation of points for improvement, and a selection of suitable future learning tasks. Well, in the past, there's been some research in how to improve these self-directed learning skills, or actually how you can facilitate those. And one way to do this is with an electronic portfolio. For example, an electronic portfolio can help students with the self-assessment by helping them select relevant criteria for their performance assessment, but they can also offer performance reviews so that they can understand how they performed, what needs to be improved, and what tasks need to be selected. Now, in the past, the research has shown that working with such a portfolio does indeed have positive effects on the development of self-directed learning and also on the student's motivation to learn. However, it's not really clear what exact factors influence the facilitation of the development of such self-directed learning skills and motivation. Furthermore, teachers need to invest a lot of time and energy in individual coaching of the students. So in my dissertation, I focused on the one hand, on trying to find out what factors influenced the effective facilitation, and on the other hand, I tried to replace a part of the teacher coaching with a self-coaching protocol. And what that means is that we analyzed teacher coaching sessions, and we use the routine parts in these sessions, which are reflexive questions such as, well, how did you do on this learning task? What do you need to improve on the learning task? Please analyze this for me. All those questions we integrated into the portfolio to help the student already reflect on his performance by himself. This brings us to the research questions. The first question I already sort of mentioned is that we wanted to find out what factors influence the facilitation of the development of self-directed learning with an e-portfolio and how this happens. Secondly, this is a bit of a long research question, but well, that's the way it is. What are the effects of using an electronic development portfolio with limited teacher coaching and the student self-coaching protocol in senior vocational education on the student's development of self-directed learning and their motivation to learn? Well, first I'd like to go into the first research question. To solve this research question, we actually conducted a systematic review into finding out what factors influence self-directed learning with an e-portfolio and also how this happens. Well, what we found out is that there are actually 5 levels of factors which influence this. The first factor is, the first level of factors is at the institutional level. At the institutional level, there needs to be support for self-directed learning. And what this means is that the institute needs to formulate a policy which helps with self-directed learning, but also it needs to educate its teachers to help students, develop their self-directed learning. Because normally, or it's what is now often the case, is that teachers work in more traditional learning environments, which means that they're not really used to helping students gain self-directed learning skills. So what the institute should do is help these teachers by offering teacher professionalization in understanding their role with self-directed learning. Well, yeah. The second level is the curriculum level, which we found. Basically, this means that the support first has to be on the institute, and then later on drops down to the curriculum level, where the portfolio really has to be integrated with all the other educational activities. This actually means that the portfolio should not add to the student's workload, but actually rather decrease it, or at least keep it the same. For example, the portfolio should be able to communicate with software which is already in place, and also to help the integration, it should be made so that there's protected time to use the portfolio. Well, perhaps the most consistent finding is on the learning process level. It is very important that students receive teacher coaching and aren't left on their own. Yeah. There's also the fourth level is the portfolio level, and basically this means that the portfolio needs to have functionalities to help the students gain self-directed learning skills. The portfolio needs to help students with the self-assessment of performance. It needs to help them with formulation of points for improvement, and it also needs to help them with selecting suitable learning tasks. Finally, it's very important that there's also a personal level, and at the personal level, it's very important that the student stays motivated to actually use the portfolio. And one way to help the student be motivated is to help him gain more autonomy. So to offer him a little bit more freedom in selecting his own learning tasks and selecting how he should assess the learning tasks. All right, for the second research question, we developed our own portfolio. It's called Perflect, and this portfolio was developed so that it can help students on the one hand with the cycle which I already discussed, and on the other hand what we added was a self-coaching protocol which already helps the students pre-reflect on his performance so that the coaching sessions with the teachers become they become easier for the teacher and for the student, and it saves him a lot of time. What we did to investigate this was 2 empirical studies. In the first study, we used Perflect during a 12-week program in a senior vocational education setting among students of engineering education. And we asked the students to select their own learning tasks and to assess as many learning tasks as they want using Perflect. Well, in addition to using Perflect, The students also receive teacher coaching on a bi-weekly basis. And for this study, we use a quasi-experimental design, which means that we had one group of about 25 students, which used Perflect on a sort of a weekly basis to self-assess their performance on learning tasks, to formulate points for improvement and select new learning tasks. They did this during their normal class hours, and in the same time they also received teacher coaching. While there was also a regular group, and this group just followed the regular teaching program. And what we looked at in this study was the effects on self-directed learning and the effects on motivation. And we did this using materials in the portfolio, like the self-assessed learning task, but we also used a questionnaire to measure self-reports on SDL and on motivation. Well, what we found were some very nice results. We found that the Perflect group actually scored higher than the regular group on both motivation and on self-directed learning, and this was especially the case for autonomous motivation. We also looked at the Perflect group as a whole to find out if over time this group improved their SDL skills, and this was also the case. Their self-assessments became more accurate, and we measured this by using their scores, the student scores, and we compared those scores with the teacher scores. If over time those scores were more alike, we saw this as a more accurate self-assessment, and this was exactly what was the case. Furthermore, the points for improvement that the students formulated were of a higher quality. And as I mentioned before, their motivation actually increased. Not only was their motivation higher than the students in the other group, but it also increased over time. However, we also had a problem in this study because there was a lot of freedom here. We offered the students, well, as I said, we offered them a lot of freedom. We asked them, you can self-assess the tasks that you want, and you can also decide when you want to assess them. We found out that we had actually quite a low number of self-assessed tasks. And this is what we wanted to improve in the next study. So we offered a little bit more structure here. This was also a 12-week, or about a 12-week period study, also in senior vocational education, but on another terrain. This was on the terrain of entrepreneurship. Here we followed the whole group of about 50 students, and we also asked them to self-assess their performance on learning tasks, but as mentioned before, it was in a more structured manner. We actually reserved time in the schools, and we reserved teacher time to make sure that they actually self-assessed the learning tasks. And the design here was a little bit different. It was a mixed method sequential explanatory design, which means that we first looked at the effects, again, on self-directed learning and motivation, but we tried to explain those effects by conducting focus groups to sort of distill the experience of the students in the process. And as mentioned before, this was a more structured process. Yeah, what we found here were drastically different results. Please ignore this sentence because it's not correct. It means this needs to be deteriorated. We actually found out that the students over time improved deteriorated SDL skills. What we found is that they actually had less accurate self-assessment, and to be more specific, over time their overconfidence grew, which is a really interesting finding. So, somehow the use of the portfolio inspired to be more overconfident over time. We found no change at all in the quality of formulated points for improvement, and we actually found a decline in autonomous motivation and an increase in controlled motivation, which are radically different results from the former study. Well, we tried to explain this with conducting a focus group, and from this focus group we found actually four themes which were dominant. The first theme here is the SDL conceptions. What we found is that the SDL conceptions among the students were really varying. We found that they had really strange conceptions. For example, one student said, well, why should I need to improve my performance? If I wanted to improve my performance, I would have done better. Which is really strange. This is a very strange finding. And this is also a bit strengthened by the second theme. All students really displayed a big need for support and for feedback. They, in addition to saying we don't really think we need to improve because if we wanted to, we would. They also said, well, I can never really know about my own performance without somebody telling me about it. So they thought this really leads to the third point, doubts about the usefulness. They thought that Perflect wasn't really useful at all because they needed their teacher to tell them what they were doing right and what they needed to improve. And they also said that they really missed that they couldn't use the portfolio in their apprenticeships because the study was planned during a period where the students didn't have an apprenticeship. And they said, well, it's a really a senseless exercise if we don't even get to use it in our apprenticeships, and furthermore, if we really don't know what we should do better, why use it at all? Which you can also see in the motivation for learning. The biggest theme here is the lack of challenge. All throughout the focus groups, students were saying, well, this is way too easy, we can already do this, why don't you give me something harder? Which is really interesting because at the same time, we also administered a domain-specific test where none of the students scored a satisfying grade. So there's a really, really big discrepancy between what the students think they can do and what they can actually do. So if we then look at the discrepancies between study 1 and study 2, we see a radically different picture. In the first study, we see the improvement of self-assessment, we see improvement in points for improvement, and we also see an increased autonomous motivation. Whereas in the second study, we see a declined self-assessment skills, we see no change in points for improvement, and we see actually a rise in controlled motivation. So we thought about, well, how can this be? And the explanation we found is that there exists a delicate balance between autonomy and support. What we found in the first study was that there was a lot of autonomy for the students, which resulted for them in high motivation and improvement in skills. But the trade-off there was that we didn't have a lot of learning opportunities in the form of assessed learning tasks. On the other hand, if you start to offer a lot of support and a lot of structure, you notice that the students well, they become a little bit rebellious. They don't like the process, they want to stop with it, and it has direct negative effects. So it's very important to keep this balance, but it's also very hard because on the one hand, you really want to give the students autonomy, but you know that the students need support. So what can we conclude from my research? Well, and how can we help Cleveland become a better student? Well, if he's to learn with an e-portfolio, we need to help him by providing support at all levels of influential factors. We need to make sure that where he studies, that the institute has teacher professionalization in place to help the teachers, that the portfolio fits well in the curriculum, that there is coaching in place, that the portfolio at least supports self-assessment of performance, formulation for points of improvement, and selection of suitable learning tasks, and that Cleveland stays motivated. What we also should do is balance the level of support and autonomy. And again, this is not an easy process, but to do so, we should probably develop portfolios which can offer their support dynamically, which offer adaptive support. Because throughout the process, you know that at the start, Cleveland will need a lot of support, whereas when he starts to master the task, he needs a lot less support. So we need to develop portfolios which are able to adapt to his need for support. And finally, if Cleveland is going to use a portfolio, he needs to be able to use it in the context of apprenticeships. What I learned throughout the studies is that especially for this group of students, senior vocational education, nothing is more important for them than practice. They need to be able to use the portfolio in their daily practice. Well, so far my talk. If you have any questions, I'll be glad to answer.